Of religious studies, likely among many of us here, because the meme so well captures the relevance and impact we hope for our majors. The meme depicts Secretary of State John Kerry with a word bubble excerpted from the very speech which Secretary Kerry introduced his appointment of Shaun Casey as Director of Religion and Global Affairs. In that speech and the subsequent word bubbles, Secretary Kerry highlighted the vital need realized in Casey for people with expertise in the study of religions. Secretary Kerry said, quote, "If I went back to college today, I would major in comparative religions because that's how integrated religion is in everything that we are deciding and thinking about in life today." We could easily imply that the professor Kerry would have handpicked to study under would have been Shaun Casey. For the next 3 years, Casey engaged with faith communities around the world, speaking, listening, and partnering to solve global challenges and to bridge divisions. Casey's example in his academic expertise and frontlines work is motivating current faculty to inspire new generations of students in state and private universities to meet demands in our world for perceptive and dedicated engagement with the complexities of religion and religious people. In his comments about Casey, Secretary Kerry also said, quote, "Shaun is a deeply thoughtful person who cares about the place of faith in our public life. Public leadership has always been and should now be a form of service. Public leadership requires a bona fide effort to give to others and do for others. And it is this kind of commitment that Shaun has exemplified throughout his life, which has been selfless, devoted, and heartfelt," unquote. This morning, we have the privilege of hearing from Professor Casey's respected insights, rage, nostalgia, and the forgetfulness of God.
Well, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Is this sound coming through all right? All right. Thank you, Josh, for the introduction, and thank you, David. I want to begin with two items, simply giving my thanks, but also offering a confession. I want to thank David Fleer in particular for his kind invitation to give this morning's lecture. Most of you don't know it, but David works really far in advance to put people on the hook for these kind of plenary lectures. I met David almost 40 years ago in a class we were taking at the time at Abilene Christian University, and if my memory serves me correctly, it was actually in a Tom Albright class. So here was this guy in jeans and a flannel shirt, despite the fact it was 110 degrees outside, hailing from some obscure place which he said was in the Northwest. I think it was Saskatoon or some related place, and I figured that was somewhere up around Muleshoe, because the Northwest began past Lubbock in my parochial worldview. He said, "You don't know me, but in 40 years or so, I want you to give a plenary lecture after you get through with your gig in the State Department." Now, I have to say, that struck me as a little odd, but it sounded like it might involve a free round-trip bus ticket to Nashville. So I said, sure, I'm happy to give you that lecture in 40 years. But I'm glad he asked, and I'm glad to be here. My confession is frankly about the evolution of the topic. When I first was actually asked to give this lecture about a year ago, I was immersed in a very intense period of international travel and work with my office related to various sites of religion and conflict around the world. From where I sat, the whole planet seemed to be aflame with conflicts of varying intensity, but in some fashion marbled with religiously fueled animus and rage. In our office, we were working on places such as Cyprus, Ukraine, Ethiopia, Iraq, Nigeria, Kosovo, Burma, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Sri Lanka, and Cuba. And if you just run that list, you see that indeed there's a lot of conflict around the world. Now, in the intervening 12 months or so after I rashly told David, yes, sure, I'm happy to come to Nashville in June of 2017, which seems so far away, I began to see that what I was encountering on the global stage, many of those dynamics in terms of religiously inflamed conflict were also burgeoning here in the United States itself. So instead of trying to talk about simply the global dynamics, I'm going to do some of that, of religion and conflict alone, I've decided to include some domestic analysis as well because I see connections. I want to explore some aspects of the growing rage I see around the world and here at home in two different sections in the paper. And I'm going to follow with a third section where I assess what I call a disturbing form of Christian response to global and local rage, and that's nostalgia. And then I'm going to conclude with a short fourth section comprised of the basic contours of a theological response to some of the dynamics I sketch out about rage at the beginning. Let me say a word, too, about my intent and my method in this address. My goal is to evoke and to provoke, but not in a systematic and comprehensive way. Trying to analyze rage on our planet would literally take a Britannica set of volumes to begin to get at it. We don't have that time here today. And I am writing a book, a larger book about what we did in our Office of Religion and Global Affairs. You can read the book when it comes out. But I want to quote a former Christian Scholars Conference plenary speaker, the poet Billy Collins, to set a mood and explain a little bit about what I'm trying to accomplish today. Collins' favorite poem of mine, at least, is Introduction to Poetry. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light, like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem and wave at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So let's just stipulate at the beginning that those of us like me, and maybe many of you who are socialized in some of the more hardened cadences of Church of Christ hermeneutics at a certain era now gone by, we're much more adept with rope and hose when it comes to interpreting texts in history in the world than we are with mice, color slides, or water skiing. So at the outset, let me commend the Collins hermeneutic as we consider a 1936 poem in a moment by an African-American poet, Sterling Brown. Now, I want to also concur with one of the many profound insights in Professor James Cones's new book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, where he observes that at times it's the poet, it's the storyteller, the songwriter and performer, or various other artists who are capable of exploring the dimensions of human life that we in the preaching and or the teaching business seem not always to be able to grasp or express. So section 1 is called Southern Cop, a poem by Sterling A. Brown. Let us forgive Ty Kendricks. The place was Darktown. He was young. His nerves were jittery. The day was hot. The Negro ran out of the alley, and so Ty shot. Let us understand Ty Kendricks. The Negro must have been dangerous because he ran. And here was a rookie with a chance to prove himself a man. Let us condone Ty Kendricks if we cannot decorate. When he found out why the Negro was running, it was too late. And all we can say for the Negro is, it was unfortunate. Let us pity Ty Kendricks. He's been through enough, standing there, his big gun smoking, rabbit scared, alone, having to hear the winches wail and the dying Negro man moan. Sterling Brown was a poet born in 1901 in Washington, D.C. He earned a bachelor's degree from Williams College and a master's degree from Harvard University. He taught in colleges as far apart as as far as Lincoln College in Jefferson City, Missouri, and Howard University in Washington, D.C. His works seem to have been overshadowed by Langston Hughes, and as a result, he's far less well-known today than he should be. When I first read this poem at some point in the last 4 years, It hit me like a punch in the gut. Given the now common headlines about yet even more African American males being shot by a policeman, the poem cracked my conscience with the sobering reality that today's headlines are not so new for, so many American families and communities. It also reinforced the stunning and heartbreaking conversation I had with a coworker in the State Department a few months before reading this poem. As an African-American woman who had served in the State Department in several posts in Africa and now working in my office, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, she had seen and learned a lot. When Taria spoke, I knew to shut up and listen. She had told me about having the talk with her two beautiful preteen sons. I sort of nodded in familiarity. I've been down that road a couple of times with my children. But she surprised me when she talked to me about how the talk that she and her husband had just had with their two sons had gone. Because you see, the talk in her household was no longer about the birds and bees, but how to comport oneself as a young black man if ever they found themselves in the presence of an officer of the law. According to Sharia, it was now a universal rite of passage in African American homes, particularly if there were young men in the family. It was to be a lifelong vigilance that had to be mastered and practiced constantly and forever. And it had permanently marked their existence in today's America. As a mother, she felt increasing anxiety as her two sons were on the cusp of adolescence and would be spending more and more time outside her immediate maternal gaze in what looked like an increasingly dangerous country, especially for African American men. While Southern Cop was published in Atlanta in 1936, its tropes and warnings resonate all too well in far too many homes in the United States today. I want us to see how Brown's carefully constructed progression of verbs in this poem manages to convey with devastating irony the moral failure of white society in the Jim Crow era, and tragically, in our era as well. The means and the vocabulary may have evolved and changed, but the violence remains the same. The threat remains. And I would argue it's premised on white rage. The immediate and context-free exhortation to this poem, "Let us forgive," signals, I think, that quick, easy forgiveness that many would extend reflexively to a white policeman without any understanding of the facts that might have transpired. Brown is trying to convey to us that a form of cheap grace is at work here where skin color predetermines moral outcomes and not the facts of a case. And our criminal justice system has institutionalized this cheap grace by routinizing the lack of accountability for resort to deadly force. Let us understand, he says, and this elaborates a skewed accounting of the event such that sympathy for the shooter is called for, thus ironically highlighting that getting the facts right is determined not by what happened, but by the social status of the actors. Ty deserves understanding, while his victim, now dying, is dismissed as unfortunate. The third paragraph begins to shed some light that even the most obtuse listener can perceive when he says, "Let us condone, even if we can't decorate the shooter. The moral disconnect cannot be completely covered up. We might condone, but even a distorted common sense has to concede that there shouldn't be any medals handed out at a ceremony at a later date." Here, the writer begins to move beyond pure irony and toward tragic, stark reality. Yet in the end, Brown calls for pitying Ty Kendricks, for his inward pain as he stands over the man he has shot dies in agony. Only the most imperceptive of listeners could miss the ironic and bitterly critical stance that Brown projects here. But alas, it's so easy for those of us in predominantly white Christian communities to do exactly that, to miss the point. When even a cursory glance at what's transpired in America in the last 8 years, in fact, frankly, longer than the last 8 years with respect to race, shows cumulative evidence to me that a revival of white rage is afoot in our country. And to be clear, it was never, ever extinct. Let me run a list of very brief statistics for you to give you a flavor of what's happening today. And I think it gives some clarity to the contours of racial backlash. The Washington Post has started a website called Fatal Force, and I commend that to you. It's an attempt to gather all the fatal police shooting data starting in 2015 and going forward. Such statistics did not exist before the Washington Post started this project, which stunned me. In 2015, police in the United States shot and killed 991 people, almost 1,000 people. 495 were white, 258 were black, and 170 were Hispanic. In 2016, the numbers were essentially unchanged, and so far in 2017, we are on track to replicate both years' numbers. 1,000 people a year are dying on our streets, disproportionately minority. The FBI's annual tracking of hate crimes paints an even more depressing picture. In 2014, there were approximately 5,500 hate crime incidents reported. In the so-called single bias incidents, 47% of those were racially motivated. And of those, 63.5% were motivated by anti-black or African-American bias. 18% of those incidents resulted from sexual orientation bias, and 18% were based on religious bias. The overwhelming majority of those were anti-Semitic, and about 16% of those were anti-Muslim. And it gets worse when you move from 2014 to 2015. Statistics about race in the American justice system are equally disturbing. The Center for American Progress reports that people of color are significantly overrepresented in the U.S. prison populations, making up more than 60% of the people behind bars. Among black males born in 2001, 1 in 3 will go to prison at some point during their lifetime. 1 in 3. 1 in 6 Latino males will have the same fate. In contrast, only 1 out of every 17 white males born that year are expected to go to prison. The war on drugs has resulted in African American and Latinos comprising 62% of those in state prisons for drug offenses, despite using and selling drugs at rates similar to those of their white counterparts. Black males face longer sentences than their white and Hispanic counterparts for similar crimes. The litany can go on for hours, chronicling the racial disparities in our criminal justice system. And then you add systematic suppression of minority voters, and pretty soon it's impossible to ignore the case that emerges about the systematic oppression of minorities in American society. You add it all together and a portrait emerges. And here the work of Emory University's Professor Carol Anderson is instructive. In her recent book, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, she skillfully traces the history of white rage since the end of the Civil War down to the present day. The upshot of her historical analysis is that whenever opportunity came to African Americans, whether during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, under Brown versus Board of Education, with the civil rights, the fair housing, and the voting rights legislation in the 1960s, and with the election of President Barack Obama, political and social institutions sprang into reaction out of white rage to counter any semblance of racial progress. Anderson deftly dismantles the rhetorical charge of black rage and exposes the historical reality that white rage is the accurate description of the reaction to any expansion of opportunity for African Americans, and this is at the root of our society's ills today. In our current political environment, with the rise of the so-called alternative right and the near universal support of white evangelical Christians for the new administration, I think it marks the largest renaissance of white rage since my childhood days in the 1960s. Section 2, Two Brothers. I want to begin this section by reading a couple of passages from the book of Genesis, beginning in Genesis 32, verse 3. Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau, in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have lived with Laban as an alien and stayed until now, and I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male and female slaves, and I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight." The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him, and the flocks and the herds and the camels, into 2 companies, thinking, if Esau comes into the one company and destroys it, then the company that is left will escape. And Jacob said, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, 'Return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good,' I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 companies. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mothers with the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number." So he spent the night there, and for what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels and their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. These he delivered into the hand of his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, "Pass on ahead of me and put a space between drove and drove." He instructed the foremost, "When Esau my brother meets you and asks you, 'To whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you?' Then you shall say, 'They belong to your servant Jacob. They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent by my lord to my lord Esau, and moreover he is behind us.' He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you meet him, and you will say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind me. For he thought, I may appease him with the presents that go ahead of me, and afterwards I shall see his face, and perhaps he will accept me." So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself spent the night in the camp. Now Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 maids. He put the maids with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on ahead of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. When Esau looked up and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the maids drew near, and they put their children, and they bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And finally Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor with my lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please, if I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you've received me with such favor. Please accept my gift that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have everything I want." So he urged him, and he took it. Then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go alongside you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me, and if they're overdriven for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly, according to the pace of the cattle that are with me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." So Esau said, "Let me leave some with you of my people who are with me." But he said, "Why should my Lord be so kind to me?" So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, but Jacob journeyed to Sukkot and built himself a house and made booths for his cattle, and therefore the place is called Sukkot. September 11th, 2001 was a Tuesday. And it was a strange day to be in Washington, D.C. as those events unfolded. I'm sure most of us here over a certain age can remember exactly where we were on that day when we heard the news of what was happening in New York and in Washington, D.C. Since I've left the State Department, I've been reflecting on the state of the world since that day 16 years ago. And my mind wandered to an episode 3 days after 9/11. I was just beginning my second year of teaching at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and I was still the new kid on the block, trying to figure out this school in this very bizarre city that I had moved into. The local NBC affiliate called the seminary, and they were looking for a faculty member to join a panel discussion that they were taping on Thursday to be aired on Sunday morning. And they wanted somebody to represent the faith community, along with representatives of the medical community, the security community, and the political community. And a senior administrator at my school, who I will not name, volunteered me without telling me that I was going to be on this panel. It's a most highly rated news show locally. And having never done any media at all at that point, I was both intrigued and absolutely terrified. Given my rookie media status, it was a bit of shock to hear my brother and sister panelists speaking confidently and apparently authoritatively about what this attack 2 days before meant for their various communities. They were all very clearly veterans of the Washington television punditocracy. I only vaguely remember mumbling something like, "Only time will tell who these people are, why they did this, and who knows what our response should be until we figure that out." Now, the disdain I got off my fellow panelists was absolutely palpable, and their message to me was clear: up your game, buddy, or you're not going to last. So the main lesson I drew at that moment, and from this inauspicious beginning to my public career, was that Washington has an insatiable hunger for instant analysis. Now, if you don't believe me, turn on CNN tonight. Okay, just saying. There's no shortage of self-appointed experts ready to fill the hunger on any subject, but especially on religion. We're still paying a price for the caricature of religions, especially Islam, on the part of those early hucksters and quacks, many of whom have made and continue to make a lot of money. 16 years later, I have a few more lessons, but I'm still troubled by what often passes for expertise on religion in public life. Everyone seems to have a license and an opinion to share when it comes to understanding religion. I want us to reflect on this passage, this long passage, and I apologize, but I don't apologize for reading that, because the sad fact is we've lost the capacity to listen to narrative. Now, some of us were genetically predisposed not to listen to narrative because of the sermons we heard as children. But still, I imposed these 30 verses on you because I think you actually do have the capacity to listen and to process. I want us to see what light we might get from these two highly dysfunctional patriarchs to guide us as we move forward in thinking about religion and conflict. You know the story. Jacob and Esau were twins, born to Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac loved Esau, the eldest, and Rebekah loved Jacob, the youngest. Esau was a hunter, and Jacob was a quiet man who lived in tents. Only one could inherit the divine blessing from God from their grandfather Abraham. The other would not. In their youth, Esau foolishly sold his inheritance to his younger brother for a bowl of soup. Esau also vexed his parents by marrying outside the clan, choosing instead the Hittite woman. There's a lesson in there somewhere about Hittite women, but I don't know what it is. Years later, when Isaac was near death, he commissioned Esau to hunt game for him and prepare a meal so he could formally transmit the blessing onto his son. In a tragic comic scene, Rebekah intervenes with Jacob to trick his blind father Isaac into giving the family blessing to him. Jacob, chaos, rage, and intrigue ensue. In the aftermath of this deceit and fraud, Esau vowed to kill Jacob after the appropriate period of mourning for Isaac's death. Rebekah overhears him take this vow. She warns Jacob. Jacob flees to his uncle's lands in a far-off city. Years go by, and we arrive at the point in the narrative we heard a few moments ago. Jacob is moving his family and animals away from his father-in-law to a place where he can grow and prosper independently. And along that way, he has to pass through the land Esau inhabits. And Jacob is rightly afraid that Esau's memory and subsequent loathing for his younger brother may still burn hot after some time or perhaps years have passed. So he develops a strategy. He sends waves of emissaries as buffers between the brothers, and each with collections of animals and gifts to meet Esau, saying in essence, I'm passing through. I hope everything is cool. I hope everything is all right between us. And then some messengers come back with the somber news that indeed Esau is coming, and he's got 400 men with him. And Jacob does what any rational economic actor would do. He panics. So he sorts his entourage into two companies and divides each into waves of animals, slaves, family, children, and more animals, hoping that if Esau starts killing, the ones in the back of the parade might escape. Or if Esau is not in a killing mood by the time Jacob and his wives and children appear at the end of the long column, he will be appeased. So what does this have to do with where we are today? The second thing I think I've learned about memory, rage, and fear has been, and probably always will be, that these things, memory, rage, and fear, are powerful drivers of human actors and behavior. If we want to understand conflict in the world, we have to understand the history of grievances. We have to know the texture and context of history and belief. And that is very, very, very hard work. It is simply much easier to overlook that history and fall back on simple platitudes about faith communities and instant analysis that's not informed by understanding complex histories of peoples and their religions. Trust me, it's hard to wrap one's brains around many of these complex histories. So many places I've traveled to as a diplomat present complex competing narratives of what caused conflict and what fed it. But memory, rage, and fear are often intertwined. We should resist the quick and instant punditry that seeks to reduce cases to simple formulas and theories. We should also reject the temptation to draw quick analogies from our own cultural, religious experience to those who may not share our various heritages, political or religious. I'll relate one anecdote. It's off text. I was in Rome with a group of global experts on religion and conflict. And the topic under discussion was, why were so many young Muslims being radicalized and leaving the West and going to Syria and going to Iraq to fight for ISIL? And I found myself in a room full of smart, worldly, highly educated people, and suddenly people were analogizing off their teenage angst religious experiences in London as possible explanations for why young Muslim men were flying all over the world by the thousands to fight for ISIL. And I began to recover the memory of being 15 years old in Paducah, Kentucky, in the angst-riven evangelical world I grew up. And I said, that is the last place to go to find an analogy that might explain the behavior of a 15-year-old Muslim growing up in West London who's contemplating going to Syria or to Iraq. But we do that all the time in the West. Instead of looking at actual experience and talking to people about their own actions and behaviors, we fall back on analogizing off our own religious experience, which leads us absolutely in the wrong direction. Religion and conflict, then, is a theory-rich, evidence-poor space as an academic discipline far too often. Here, grand theory and shallow theology that pushes for reconciliation prematurely can be counterproductive. There are very few cases where the pursuit of reconciliation leads easily, and that the adverb is important, easily, to peace. But the biblical scene here does not end with Jacob's plotting from fear. When Esau finally wades through the long chorus line of livestock Jacob has choreographed and gets to Jacob, he runs to meet his younger brother. He embraces him. He kisses him. He weeps. Now, while Jacob was still plotting and offering his family and animals as gifts to Esau, Esau demurs and he says he doesn't need them. But he does accept them as a gift, which is very interesting. And I don't fully understand that. But he does take the gifts at first. I mean, after first saying no, he appears to have moved on from the earlier episode of deceit. Now, this is a great example, at least to me, about how the biblical narrative often subverts my contemporary impulses. As a listener, we may be set up to expect a bloodbath at the hands of the unlucky older brother who's been robbed of his fame and fortune and divine blessing by his no-good, lousy, conspiratorial younger brother and his mother. There's no clash of civilizations being played out here. Instead, a deeply wronged party has resisted the very deep human impulse for vengeance or violence. Love or some other force has somehow triumphed over hate. But maddeningly, we are not privy to how and why Esau changed his mind. There's no program, there's no recipe for peace here. It just happened. And this is the third thing I think I've learned. The hardcore political realists of our age who run our world are wrong. People can and do change. Memory is not fate. Human nature is not fully fixed. Hatred and power are not the only forces at work in human beings. Love and transformation are possibilities. God's promise to Abraham has been given to the next generation, and it's not been subverted by human violence. There are reasons for hope in the face of what appears to be intractable violence, but this hope doesn't seem premised on Jacob's peace plan. If the narrative ended here, we would have the perfect feel-good lecture. And trust me, there was nothing I would rather do than deliver to you the perfect feel-good lecture on religion, rage, and conflict. Sadly, the text keeps going. Now, I could stop. I could cut it off here. And frankly, I think a lot of sermons do that. And it was when I revisited this passage not too long ago, I realized I cut it off there thinking the embracing scene was the perfect John Ford movie ending in the desert, and they all lived happily ever after. But the text points us in a less perfect direction, much to the professor's chagrin. Esau says to Jacob, let's travel together down south to my home. And yet Jacob hedges. He says, my party is slow, we're tired. You going ahead, brother. Esau then says, well, okay, I'll go ahead. Let me leave some of my entourage with you to help you along. And again, Jacob's like prevaricating and says, we don't want to slow you down, Esau. So we'll see you on down the line in a while. Esau relents. He heads south towards home. And this is where a map actually helps a little bit when you're going through the names. Jacob makes a mad dash west, putting miles between their companies, never going to visit Esau in the south. Now, many an interpreter stops with Esau's bear hug of Jacob, ignoring the fact that brothers have not reconciled in any deep sense. There's no bloodshed, but there's not a reknitting of the family brotherhood. We really don't know how deep Esau's apparent change of heart goes. The biblical story continues with the saga of Jacob and his sons, and Esau recedes as the story of the promises made to Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, moves forward. So what are we to make of this if it's not the John Ford perfect ending? Herein I see a fourth lesson. We in the West spend a lot of time hoping for and working toward fairy tale endings in our global politics. I know, because for 4 years people came and told me the fairy tale endings in all of the countries I listed at the beginning of my lecture. If only you did this, Shaun, we would have that kind of peace in that country. But what we have here in the Jacob and Esau story is what St. Augustine once called peace of a sort. It isn't the eschatological peace of the kingdom of God. It isn't paradise. It's not even a good ending to a television miniseries, but it is worth noting and modestly celebrating. We hunger for the dramatic, heroic, permanent reduction of diplomatic crises, but more often than not, the best we get is peace of a sort. Instead, I would say our diplomatic work is far more akin to what the great German scholar Max Weber said about a century ago about politics. He said, politics is a strong and slow boring of hard boards. It takes both passion and perspective. Certainly, all historical experience confirms the truth that man would not have attained the possible unless time and again he had reached out for the impossible. So what is the upshot from this ancient text for our day? If there's a word from God, it might run something like this. In the wider frame, God's promises of peace and blessing are played out in the lives of and via the agency of complex, flawed, and ordinary people. For the most part, in the biblical narrative, God does not deliver these divine promises of peace as an overt actor. Instead, we who live in the aftermath of the horrible day of 9/11 or other violent crises should keep on doing what we've always done. Seek to partner with anyone of goodwill, no matter what their religion or politics is, in the pursuit of peace, justice, and love. We come together in our diverse religious beliefs and practices not to pat ourselves on the back about our wisdom in just meeting for the sake of meeting. Rather, we work together to feed the poor, welcome the refugee, comfort the grieving, and do myriad concrete acts that push back the frontiers of evil, no matter how small or insignificant such acts may appear. For in so doing, we may help birth a peace of a sort in our own time. Section 3. Having taken 2 looks into this topic of rage, I now want to turn to a troubling but all too common Christian response to rage, and that is the nostalgia. I'm trying here to answer the question, why are so many American Christians attracted to nostalgia today? I also hear the voice of my 23-year-old daughter who responds to any declaration I make, and Dad, what is wrong with that? So there's some people for whom nostalgia is a good thing, and I'm trying to address you if you're here today. I'm trying to argue that nostalgia is not a Christian virtue. The more often than not, nostalgia masks darker impulses while explicitly marketing certain forms of virtue that delude and misdirect Christian theology while purporting to restore some lost theology or practice. Nostalgia is a misbegotten form of memory. It is the pursuit of that which never was, in the pursuit of addressing some perceived current malady. Nostalgia needs a narrative of failure and loss to be attractive and to be intellectually or psychologically effective. Something from the past has disappeared or it's currently existentially threatened in order to make the appeal to restoring what has been lost persuasive. Ironically, what is lost often proves to be imaginary and not real. I'll get to that in a moment. Nevertheless, memory manufactured or misbegotten can be as powerful as memory of real events. And we need to be able to separate the two. Note, for example, the current backlash to the removal of Confederate monuments in certain cities in the United States. One way to get into this complex of issues is to look at a contemporary ecclesiastical species of nostalgia. And for that, I want to talk a little bit about a new book by Rod Dreher called The Benedict Option. I can't rehearse the whole book here, but I commend it to you. It's short, it's not taxing, and it's having some modest success in a disturbing number of Christian communities around the country. It is a great example of the sort of Christian nostalgia marketing schemes that we see periodically in American Christian thought. Let me parse in 5 steps the argument of the Benedict option. First of all, it's alarmingly intellectually syncretistic. He invokes Alistair McIntyre, Wendell Berry, the Rule of St. Benedict, and some contemporary Russian Orthodox thinkers moving around and ignoring the Pope Francis option. And this theological syncretism is in the service of propping up a thing he calls traditional Christianity. And it's offered straight up with no sense of irony that he's offering a defense of an allegedly permanent divine pattern or thing, traditional Christianity, by a set of thinkers who are not all members of traditional Christianity and in fact are intellectually incompatible themselves. But don't get in his way. Secondly, he posits a fall from purity and understanding. Now, this is not Adam and Eve falling in the garden. It's not Alistair McIntyre's critique of sloppy Cambridge moral philosophers who unleashed emotivism upon the world. No. The end of Western civilization, according to his lights, took place in 2015, if you were not paying attention, with a modification, with two political acts. One was the modification of the Indiana Religious Freedom Law, which, if left standing, would have allowed widespread discrimination against homosexuals, and the soon thereafter U.S. Supreme Court decision in Obergefell, which allowed same-sex marriage in all 50 states. Now, those were, I'm not denying the complexity around the controversy, but I'm just simply saying for him, these are the two markers that mark the end of traditional Christianity in Western civilization. Often in these sorts of fall narratives, one can find a genealogical impulse to rattle the chains all the way back in order to find out just precisely who it was that made the first mistake, that tipped the first domino that led to the avalanche we allegedly are undergoing today. He characterizes these two political events as an attack on the religious freedom of Christians, which is a common conservative political trope in our day. If you compare that to the U.S. Department FBI's hate crime statistics, you'll see a discrepancy of perspective. And I commend that data to you if you need the comparison. The greatest marker of the existential threat to traditional Christianity had been promulgated by Indiana legislators and the 5 members of the Supreme Court. I don't know these people from Adam, but somehow I don't think they are the enemies of Christianity in America today. I can only say it's a sad, sad misreading of the signs of the times. Third, what was threatened was a nostalgic conception he calls traditional Christianity. What is traditional Christianity, you might ask? For Dreher, it's a hypothetical construct consisting of some evangelical Protestants, some Roman Catholics, and some Orthodox Christians, most of whom don't understand who their co-religionists are, but he puts them together from these 3 camps. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never lived in a neighborhood where such a church of traditional Christianity actually existed. But he's created it nonetheless. And I think it's crucial to see that most, perhaps all, narratives of nostalgic restoration have to have had a golden era that needs to be restored or waited for. In this case, it's a fairy tale creature that never existed. And let me be very clear, Christ did not die for traditional Christianity. I searched the scriptures in vain. I searched Christian history in vain for that affirmative theological declaration, but that's the heart of this project. And fourth, some sort of waiting, coping, hanging on period is necessary until a better day comes. For this author, the formula consists of homeschooling your kids, since public schools are the primary source of attacks on Christians, finding some sort of traditional Christian community probably to be found in a small town and not a liberal urban area, getting off the internet, but apparently still accessing the author's Twitter account because he's got quite a following there. I suggest this plan does nothing to address the form of rage I talked about in my first section. For African Americans, at least the ones I talk to and know and learn from, there's no golden American moment that they want to restore. If you have doubts about that, read Thurgood Marshall's 1987 speech on the bicentennial of the Constitution. If you want to have a refresher course on why constitutional originalism has very little appeal to contemporary African Americans today. Alas, 2014, 1 year before the legal earthquake the author invokes, can hardly be convincingly argued as the apex of Christianity in the West. Now, in contrast, as I segue into the last section, in contrast to this vision of a nostalgic retreat to protect the church from the evil of the world, I want to point us to a different ecclesiology, one that sees engagement with and in the world as central in contrast to withdrawal. Here, the role of the church in the world is radically different from that is seen in the Benedict option. I'm going to read you a passage. I'm going to ask anybody if you know where it's from. I'll buy you a free drink at Starbucks if you can tell me what this is from. The joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these too are the joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the followers of Christ. For theirs is a community composed of men, united in Christ. They are led by the Holy Spirit in their journey to the kingdom of their Father, and they have welcomed the news of their salvation, which is meant for every man. That is why this community realizes that it is truly and intimately linked with mankind and its history. To carry out such a task, the church has always had the duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times and interpreting them in light of the gospel. Thus, in language intelligible to each generation, she can respond to the perennial questions which men ask about the present life and the life to come, and about the relationship of the one to the other. We must therefore recognize and understand the world in which we live, its expectations, its longings, and its often dramatic characteristics. Anybody? $3 free latte? Well, the sexist language ought to be a clue. It was written in 1965. It's the last document promulgated by the Second Vatican Council called Gaudium et Spes, Joys and Hopes. It was perhaps the most revolutionary document written in the contemporary Catholic Church. It unleashed an amazing explosion of social justice activity around the planet. I want you to think about these two paragraphs as background for my closing remarks here. I'm not going to try and summarize the vast themes of rage, memory, and nostalgia. What I want to do in the closing is to offer three sets of suggested ways forward, answering a set of questions. How do we sort memory as a theological category? What are some concrete implications of the embedded theology of solidarity with all humanity that Gaudium et Spes recommends to us? And finally, how does the notion that God is capable of remembering our sins no more influence our stance about memory and oppression? First, let me confess, if you haven't sensed it by now, I don't believe all memories are created equal when viewed morally. Remembering Robert E. Lee on the part of a white supremacist is not the moral equivalent of an African American remembering abolition. Now, the Klan is coming to Charlottesville, Virginia, not far from where I live, on July 8th. Now, that's going to be really interesting because the good citizens of Charlottesville want to take General Lee down from his perch and down from his horse and erase that memory. And it's producing a spasm of white rage in the state where I currently live. But one way of sorting the different moral valences of memories is to ask, toward what moral ends are such memories cultivated? In the example I just gave, the alt-right white supremacist who reveres Lee for current political goals is trying to promote racial bias, discrimination, even violence. The cultivation and preserving the knowledge of the abolitionist movement can be a goal of racial equality and the current fight to secure and preserve civil rights. They are not morally equivalent. They are not theologically equivalent. Many more such ethical analyses can be brought to bear on the clashing memories that are nurtured, grown, and harvested in American churches and in public settings today. I'm simply commending the exercise of applying the question, toward what moral goals are these productions of memory directed? Goals such as love, accountability, solidarity, transformation, peace, social justice, forgiveness, and reconciliation can be defended on theological grounds, while goals such as hate, violence, silencing oppression, and racial retrenchment cannot be defended. Secondly, now, can I give some concrete pointers or examples that illustrate the sort of embedded theology where Christian communities or institutions deploy the sort of theological activity envisioned by Gaudium et Spes? And let me simply say there are shelves and libraries full of books that do this kind of thing. I'm not going to be comprehensive here. Instead, I'm going to offer two concrete examples you might want to look at. The first would be the work of my colleagues at Georgetown University. Now, I'm a rookie there. I can claim no credit. But I do work at an institution. I draw a paycheck that is still subsidized from the sale of almost 300 African-American slaves in 1837. So I am complicit to the extent I took that job. I am complicit in the history of slavery in the United States. But what our president did a couple of years ago was to say we need to respond to our own history of owning and selling slaves in the 19th century in order to keep the college running. There would be no Georgetown University today had the slaves not been owned and then sold. Under the leadership of our current president, he established a working group of slavery, memory, and reconciliation that undertook a systematic examination of this sordid history, and the university is in the process of setting responses to that legacy. Google and you can find the report. If you Google Georgetown, slavery, memory, and reconciliation, you can see the historic and the current processes set in place. Because how do you reconcile with people who are long since dead? How do you make reparation? It's an exceedingly complex moral issue. But I'm actually proud of what the university is doing. And I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's complete. I'm not saying it's replicable. What I am saying is that theologically shaped responses worthy of serious study is modeled here, and other educational and ecclesiastical institutions can look at that exemplar and see how it might help them address long unaddressed historical moral failures regarding race. The second concrete case I would commend to you is Martin Luther King's historical work in Stride Toward Freedom, his telling of the Montgomery bus boycott. I find this text remains powerful as a roadmap, as powerful a roadmap as I know, for how to organize a peace and justice at the city level. It puts flesh on the bones of the fourfold model of nonviolent resistance campaigns that King outlines in his letter from Birmingham City Jail. And finally, I want to say a few words about this thing I've alluded to and danced around and avoided until the final minutes, because it's the hardest part for me. And that's this notion that we see in the book of Jeremiah in the covenant renewal ceremony there, then in the New Testament book of Hebrews, which is a gloss and an exegesis of that passage in Jeremiah that states very forthrightly that a day is coming when God will remember our sin no more. I'm troubled on the one hand by how forgetting past atrocities can shortcut justice, restoration, and reconciliation. And it's always funny that it's the perpetrators who want to forget and move on. The victims seem to say, no, wait a minute, I have a story to tell. And it's the oppressors who say, no, we don't need to do that. That was long ago. But then there's still the question, is it ultimately possible to truly forgive while perpetually nursing and preserving the multitudinous litany of human injustice? I have no simple answer to that question, other than to provisionally say, I hope that the ultimate forgiveness on God's part can have a powerful proleptic force upon us now, for those of us here and now who know we are forgiven. That is to say, while I seem to have a brain keenly attuned to remembering all manner of slights and sins aimed in my direction, can I truly forgive others while maintaining this archival memory preservation project in my own head? Perhaps the realization that I have been forgiven ultimately may empower me to transcend my pitiful selfishness and to learn to forget too. But I'm not there yet. But I've read about some who may be. And let me close reading a passage. The byline reads, the New York Times, June 19th, 2015, Charleston, South Carolina. Nikita Stewart and Richard Perez Pena are the authors. One by one, they looked to the screen in a corner of the courtroom on Friday into the expressionless face of the young man charged with making them motherless, snuffing out the life of a promising son, taking away a loving wife for good, bringing a grandmother's life to a horrific end, and they answered him with forgiveness. You took something very precious away from me, said Nadine Collier, daughter of 70-year-old Ethel Lance, her voice rising in anguish. I will never talk to her ever again. I will never be able to hold her again. But I forgive you. and have mercy on your soul. The occasion was a bond hearing, the first court appearance of the suspect, Dylan Roof, for the murders thought to be racially motivated of 9 black men and women during Bible study at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church on Wednesday night, Mother Emmanuel. It was as if the Bible study had never ended, as one after another, victims' family members offered lessons in forgiveness, testaments to a faith that is not compromised by violence and grief. They urged him to repent, confess his sins, and turn to God. We welcomed you Wednesday night in our Bible study with open arms, said Felicia Sanders, the mother of 26-year-old Tawanza Sanders, a poet who died trying to save his aunt, who was also killed. You have killed some of the most beautifulest people that I know, she said in a quavering voice. Every fiber in my body hurts, and I will never be the same. Tawanza Sanders is my son, but Tawanza was my hero. Tawanza was my hero. But as we say in Bible study, we enjoyed you, but may God have mercy on you. The statements offered a moment of grace in a day when new details emerged about a massacre that has stunned the nation, echoing a long history of racial violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun, for a provocative plenary. Nostalgia is not a Christian virtue, and engagement with the world is essential. Thank you for an interplenary plenary. Mentioning Billy Collins and James Cone warms our hearts. And Shaun can be enchanting, regaling us with the new and the novel tales from D.C. and the State Department, while reminding us of our own narrative story. But Shaun has one eye on the times and another eye on the text. And the biblical narrative subverts our presuppositions, reminding us that there is no easy recipe for peace, but people can and do change. You don't need to wait for the book. This afternoon and again tomorrow morning, Shaun will be engaged in sessions, and while we have no time now for Q&A, there will be further engagement both this afternoon and this tomorrow morning. Now it's time for lunch. We have several options: conferees lunch in the Bison cafeteria across the way, theology, history, and civil rights, table sectioned off in the Bison Cafe, philosophers working lunch there as well, networking lunch for business, computing, and engineering, the faculty club upstairs there, women in STEM in the mezzanine, again, outside the Bison Cafe, and then the Festschrift presentation luncheon for Rick Oster in the Paul Roger Boardroom in Eazell Center. I told you we're interdisciplinary. Thank you. We'll see you somewhere at lunch.